All new for autumn. Press red to watch now on BBC iPlayer.
The BBC News at 6 o'clock with Sophie Raworth.
At 6, an exclusion zone has been set up around the Cenotaph in London amidst concern about protests over Remembrance weekend. Almost 2,000 officers will be on duty. There are fears that a pro-Palestinian demonstration could be met by counter-protests from the far right.
The police's job this weekend is to keep everybody safe, whether exercising their right to protest, whether coming down to counter-protest, but particularly for those veterans and our really vulnerable communities who are scared.
Also on the programme, Israeli forces encircle hospitals inside Gaza City. An attack near one big hospital last night. Others in Gaza City are surrounded. Israel says Hamas is operating from within the hospitals. Warnings about children getting hold of vapes containing illegal drugs after a 12-year-old boy collapses. And back to people and checkouts. The supermarket Booths decides to scrap self-service tills in almost all of its shops, a UK first.
On BBC London, remembering Eliane Andam, who was stabbed to death on her way to school. Her aunt tells us about the family's devastation ahead of the teenager's funeral tomorrow.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Metropolitan Police is imposing an exclusion zone around the Cenotaph and Whitehall in central London, ahead of the pro-Palestinian march and Remembrance events this weekend. Almost 2,000 police officers will be on duty as people from across the UK come to the capital. It comes as Downing Street says the Prime Minister has full confidence in the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, after growing calls to sack her over an article accusing the police of bias. Our Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young has more.
At 11 tomorrow morning, crowds will gather here to mark the end of the First World War. Later, in another part of London, tens of thousands will take to the streets, calling for a ceasefire in an ongoing conflict in the Middle East. A political row has erupted about the policing of these two events. Scotland Yard says a huge security operation is underway, far greater and more complex than previous years.
We do have intelligence that there will be people coming for a counter-protest, and the police's job this weekend is to keep everybody safe, whether exercising their right to protest, whether coming down to counter-protest, but particularly for those veterans and our really vulnerable communities who are scared and who are frightened. And our job is to ensure that they are safe and that they feel safe, and that is what our plan is there to do.
These weekly demonstrations have prompted the Home Secretary to accuse the police of favouritism. In the Times, she wrote that pro-Palestinian mobs were largely ignored, while right-wing protesters were met with a stern response.
Are you resigning, Home Secretary?
Her article wasn't approved by Downing Street. There's been no reprimand from the Prime Minister, but others are deeply concerned.
You have to make decisions based on the law, not based on popularity or polls. We are in danger of turning the police into an arm of the state directed by politicians.
Suella Braverman didn't make the changes to her article that Rishi Sunak wanted, and he hasn't repeated her criticism of the police. But plenty of Tory MPs are backing her.
Number 10 has full confidence in Suella. She has not breached cabinet responsibility. She's not criticised government policy. She's set out an opinion publicly that many of the public share.
Downing Street says the government's focused on making sure this weekend's events go ahead without disruption. Some think the outspoken remarks by Suella Braverman have made that more difficult. She's openly defied Rishi Sunak and he is under pressure to act. But for now it seems that dealing with the Home Secretary is on hold. The most pressing issue now is what happens on London streets this weekend. The Met says it's constantly gathering intelligence and developing its tactics so that anyone trying to cause disorder is quickly dealt with. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, the Metropolitan Police have allowed tomorrow's march organised by the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign to go ahead under certain conditions. Protesters will gather at Hyde Park at midday, an hour after the Armistice Day 2-minute silence. Their march route will avoid the Cenotaph and finish at the US Embassy in South London. Well, our home editor Mark Easton joins us now from outside New Scotland Yard. And a difficult weekend for the police, a lot of pressure on them.
Yes, and we've just heard actually, Sophie, from a source close to the Home Secretary that Suella Braverman met with Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, this afternoon, and he expressed his thoughts on exactly how their policing operation is going to go, the plans to ensure public order and that everyone is kept safe. And interestingly, the Home Secretary has emphasised her, and I quote, full backing for the police in what will be a complex and challenging situation, and expressed confidence that any criminality will be dealt with robustly. So you can hear in that, I think, a very different tone from the allegations of bias in her article in The Times earlier this week. And this, of course, follows Number 10's statement of expressing confidence in her. The two things maybe not entirely unconnected. I think the expectation is that the police do have the capacity and the skill to protect everybody and the Cenotaph tomorrow. And the hope perhaps that the sight of thousands of people exercising their right to protest will remind people that that is a freedom won for them by the sacrifices made in 2 world wars.
Mark Easton, thank you. Israeli forces are now right outside some of Gaza City's major hospitals, including the largest, Shifa. Israel says these are places where Hamas is hiding. Now, the purple areas on the map here show where the IDF troops are now. They've encircled Gaza City. And have a look at this footage taken from inside the Al-Rantisi Children's Hospital in Gaza City. You can clearly see the tank there in the narrow street right outside the hospital. And people there have been told that if they're not medical staff or patients, they must leave. And that's because Israel says Hamas are in tunnels beneath the hospital, which Hamas denies. There's fighting around 3 other hospitals close by. There's been at least 1 attack near Al-Shifa hospital. The Palestinian Red Crescent says Israeli snipers have fired at Al-Quds hospital, and those inside say it is surrounded. And the Indonesian hospital has also been damaged. Well, with the very latest, here's Lucy Williamson, and there are distressing images in her piece.
Gaza's hospitals are seen by locals as places of shelter, by Israel as hiding places for Hamas. At Al-Shifa hospital, the displaced live side by side with the wounded, the line between them sometimes very thin. Why? She's screaming. Israel says this is where Hamas has its underground headquarters. It's now surrounded by Israeli troops.
We were staying on the 5th floor, and then we found bombs falling on us. My niece was killed. She was already wounded from before, but now she's dead.
Tanks filmed inside this children's hospital. A sign that the battle between Israel and Hamas is closing in. The streets around these places of refuge now so dangerous that even those who want to leave sometimes can't. Tonight, the director of Al-Shifa hospital said shooting had started again there.
We have over 60 patients in intensive care, 50 babies in incubators and 500 patients on dialysis. They can't be treated anywhere else in Gaza. We are staying here with the injured and the displaced.
Israeli forces are now deep inside Gaza. The bombed-out buildings say as much about the difficulty of reaching their enemy as about Israel's military might.
The army has started employing new methods against those inside the tunnels and to destroy the tunnels. All our forces are working to find unique solutions, working and succeeding.
Israel's overwhelming military force has put tanks in the heart of Gaza City, but military control of the territory is just the first step. And the closer Israel gets to its dual goals of Hamas and the hostages, the more delicate this operation becomes.
Negotiations over how to get more than 200 hostages out of Gaza have faltered before. Today, amid new hopes of a deal, talks between Qatar and Egypt.
I hear all the news And I hear the news about Qatar, the Egyptian. It's better not to have any opinion on it. And it is very difficult because for us, every small news, it's a light.
Israel has promised to protect its citizens, those in Gaza and those at home. Gazans are forced to rely on the promises of Hamas and the promises of international law. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Southern Israel.
And just to say, there is plenty more on the Israel-Gaza war, which you can find in the podcast called The Conflict, and that is on BBC Sounds. The UK economy flatlined between July and September, according to the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics. Interest rate rises have hit all areas of the economy, especially new house building and consumer spending. Here's our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
When construction companies are going bust, house building, like at this new development in Sussex, can grind to a halt, and so can the entire economy. 5 minutes away at the Lancing Industrial Park, the effects of fewer new houses has a knock-on impact at the factory for newly built kitchens.
We're currently tracking at around 30% down as a general market around house build new sites, and that in turn of course is impacting our business heavily. So certainly for us as a business it is a growth problem, not an inflation problem. So inflation can also always be tackled by different measures, and it all comes back to the market decline that we have seen across house build as an industry.
At Yargo's Cafe on site, stability is better than a falling economy, but the owner, Lucy, says purse strings are being kept very tight.
People are being very careful what they buy. They don't have lunch every day necessarily now.
So they've stopped eating breakfast and they've stopped having lunch every day?
Yeah, sometimes people don't come in for a couple of days, whereas you'd see the same person every day. Yeah. I think people are being very careful with their money.
Next week's figures on inflation should be better news, with the headline rate possibly falling below 5%, still high, but less than half what it was a year ago. But today's figures show an economy failing to grow and at worst still at risk of a mild recession.
Morning team, how are we? Hi Faisal, nice to see you. You well? Yes. Good.
As he finalises his autumn budget, the Chancellor is pinning the subdued economy mainly on interest rate rises.
It is of course the case that while you are bearing down on inflation, interest rates are higher, that will have an impact on growth. Despite that, the British economy has performed far better than many people predicted. But what we now want to see is really healthy, strong growth, and that's what you'll be hearing from me about. Lots of things that we can do to unlock that growth going forward.
One thing people would talk to directly is the idea that if you cut taxes, you can help boost growth.
My priority is growth, so cutting business taxes is the thing that's most important at this stage. When it comes to personal taxes, there are no shortcuts.
But the opposition says that stagnation is now a new normal.
There's got to be a plan for growth in that autumn statement. Over the last 13 years, the UK economy has drifted along with barely any growth at all. And as a result of that, working people have got less money.
Back at the industrial estate, sausage makers have a sense of the entrails of the economy.
Trying to keep a positive attitude. You can't give up and go home. You just have to find a new way.
Recession avoided for now, but firm recovery remains elusive. Faisal Islam, BBC News in Sussex.
Prince Harry has been given permission to take the publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday to trial, claiming his privacy was breached by private investigators. And he's not alone. He's one of 7 celebrities and prominent people, including Sir Elton John and his partner David Furnish and the actress Liz Hurley, who say the same happened to them. They've accused associated newspapers of hiring private detectives to bug their homes, cars and phones. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons.
This case began in the spring with relatively dry legal arguments, so it was a surprise when the Duke of Sussex unexpectedly turned up. So did Baroness Lawrence, mother of murdered Stephen. Her allegations are among the most striking from this high-profile group. They allege journalists paid private investigators for bugging cars and phones, hacking voicemail messages, paying police officials, and obtaining medical and financial records. The law says they should have claimed within 6 years, and these allegations go back decades. So Associated Newspapers wanted the judge to throw them out, but the 7 said they'd never realised they had a case. One reason, 12 years ago at the Leveson Public Inquiry, the Daily Mail editor Paul Dacre denied his papers were involved in unlawful activities, including phone hacking.
I can be as confident as any editor, having made extensive inquiries into his newspaper's practices and held an inquiry, that phone hacking was not practised by the Mail on Sunday or the Daily Mail.
The judge, Mr. Justice Nicklin, said that the 7 claimants have a real prospect of proving that Associated Newspapers concealed its activities in the past, preventing them from taking legal action. Now, the 7 do still have to prove that, but they will now get the chance to do so in a trial at court, probably next year. Associated Newspapers' response, as we have always made unequivocally clear, the lurid claims made by Prince Harry and others of phone hacking, landline tapping, burglary and sticky window microphones are simply preposterous. We look forward to establishing this in court in due course. Potentially crucial evidence could include Mail newspaper records of payments to private investigators, but they were passed confidentially to the Leveson inquiry, and the judge ruled they should remain confidential.
It's really ironic that the Daily Mail, which is a newspaper which has often called for transparency from organisations and people in all other walks of life, have gone so far to try and restrict the information that's accessible to the claimants in this case.
It's now likely that Prince Harry will be back in court next year. Tom Simons, BBC News.
Time is just after 6:15. Our top story this evening. An exclusion zone has been set up around the Cenotaph in London amidst concern about protests over Remembrance weekend. And coming up, we're back with Britain's loneliest sheep to see how she's settling into her new home.
And on BBC London, billions of tonnes of sewage dumped in the Thames. It's being called an environmental crime. And pop superstar Leona Lewis chats to us ahead of her UK-wide Christmas tour.
A head teacher has warned that children are at risk of dying because they're using vapes that have been found to contain illegal drugs. Glyn Potts says a 12-year-old boy at his school collapsed after using a vape which contained a very strong laboratory-made form of cannabis called spice. More and more children are using vapes regularly now, despite it being illegal for them to be sold to the under-18s. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
We've been investigating the increasing numbers of children now vaping, finding out what effect it's having on behaviour and health. We've seen how vapes are readily available and some kids are getting hooked.
It's not something you can stop that easy.
How some vapes are highly toxic.
This device was found to have high levels of lead, nickel and chromium.
And we heard how a 12-year-old's lung collapsed after vaping.
Come on boys, thank you, keep going.
Now we're in Oldham to speak to a head teacher.
I pray that we don't have a fatality in these kind of instances, but I do fear that that is likely to happen if we don't address these matters. Year 11, come on.
One of his own pupils was taken to A&E after inhaling a vape containing spice, a synthetic form of cannabis, but much, much stronger.
He took one very, very large inhalation of this vape pen, and by the time he'd got off the bus on the school grounds, felt very, very unwell. Before he actually arrived at the school gates, he'd collapsed on the floor.
Cameras and alarms stop kids vaping in school time, but he says he can't protect them once they leave.
The difficulty in raising this as an issue is the perception would be that this school has an issue with vape pens. That's not true. We're comfortable that we can manage and mitigate the risk of vape pens in school. But if they're collapsing in the street, if they're collapsing in areas where they know they're not necessarily going to be found as quickly, that gives me nightmares. That's something we've got to address.
Police sent a number of vapes from the school to this lab. Their results prompted a public health alert to police and NHS staff. In September, police again sent vapes to the lab after 2 pupils at another school in the area collapsed after using vapes containing THC, the main chemical in cannabis.
We obtained these 2 e-liquid vapes. The pink one contains this very thick, viscous, honey-like substance. And when we analysed it, it was actually determined to contain 90% THC. That is significantly higher than, say, street cannabis, which has concentrations of between about 20 to 40%. This is a step change of significance.
Police have started working more closely with schools and the council, sharing intelligence and information on illegal vapes and trying to understand how children are using them.
These vapes are being used communally in schools, so the schools will find them in lockers, on top of lockers, in drawers, left around the place, changing rooms where different children can use them at different times. So these illicit and illegal vapes has become the main priority of our 2 schools-based officers.
The issues around vapes are a significant concern for us because of the ease of access and the sheer number of young people who come into contact with these kind of devices.
The school has heard that pupils are travelling out of town and putting themselves at risk by buying illegal vapes.
We've had one young person who's talked to us about how they obtain illicit vapes, and that was using the tram system coming from areas of South Manchester where they've never really been before. We fear that actually that's becoming a network to distribute these illicit vapes and to get them into the hands of young people across the entire region.
The head argues that schools, parents and communities are behind the curve and struggling to understand the scale of the problem.
I think it was a safeguarding issue day one from us, and we're trying to gather intelligence and information as to the impact of vapes. But the reality is we've not caught up with the pace of change, and we've got to do more to make sure we're better equipped to manage it.
Ministers say they're working on plans to restrict the supply of vapes, but the message here is if action isn't taken very soon, it'll become an NHS problem, not an education one. Hugh Pym, BBC News, Oldham.
A supermarket chain that operates across the north of England has become the first in the UK to return to fully staffed checkouts. Booths is cutting almost all its self-service tills in nearly all of its 28 stores. Well, Danny Savage joins us now from one of them in Clitheroe.
Yeah, Sophie, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? Doing away with self-service tills in an era of ever-increasing automation. Now, booths admit that it might not work for other supermarkets in other locations, but they believe this is the right decision for their customers and their business.
Shopping in booths is much like any other food buying experience. Although it has to be said, this is an upmarket supermarket.
Good afternoon.
But when you get to the checkout, there's a noticeable difference compared to some of the other big chains. You have to interact with another human.
Never mind.
This business has done away with self-service checkouts.
In a shop like ours, enough like ours, where we have lots of loose produce, lots of loose bakery items, it slows the whole thing down, it makes it really complicated. And go towards them with a bottle of wine, then all of a sudden you need that personal interaction anyway. So from a practical point of view, they don't really suit our kind of business.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
And then a customer interrupts the interview.
And then when we come to a checkout, we love a bit of a natter. You know, we talk to people. We're not computers. We're not robots.
Booth says it's responding to the views of customers. Checkouts, they say, are a place for conversation.
We've had customers coming in and they've complained about the screens, and they've complained before when we did have the self-service checkouts that they didn't like them. So I think they like the one-to-one bit of it and being able to talk to a person.
You come in, you have a chat with the people as you come through. That's fantastic, but the main thing is the jobs for young people in the future. Computers are taking away too many jobs as it is.
But as the old saying goes, you can't please all of the people all of the time.
I think it's quite nice to have the personal touch. I would say the biggest disadvantage, if you just pop in for 2 or 3 items, it's very inconvenient.
So for most shops in this chain, the words unexpected item in the bagging area are a thing of the past. Danny Savage, BBC News, Clitheroe.
We return now to the story of Fiona, Britain's loneliest sheep. She had been stranded at the bottom of this cliff in the Scottish Highlands, and she was finally rescued last weekend, looking like that. Our Scotland correspondent, Alexandra Mackenzie, has been to visit her in her new home in Dumfries.
Fiona in her new home, unfazed by the worldwide publicity.
We're just letting her settle into her surroundings, and then after that we're going to start socialising with her, get her, hopefully she'll start eating out of her hand, and she'll start just getting used to people as well.
After 2 years isolated at the bottom of a cliff on the Cromarty Firth, Fiona was rescued at the weekend by 5 farmers, including Cammy Wilson.
I'm very glad my mum is going to watch this
After she knows I'm home safe, she'll be terrified.
They admitted it was dangerous,
Puffing her tail, I'll get a wee lift.
but after 2 hours, they were safely at the top. Then it was time for her first ever shearing. A whopping 9 kilograms of wool was removed.
This sheep is special. There is no way, there's no other way to describe it. The way she's just came into this new environment, totally relaxed. I think she knows what's happening now, because whenever there's a film crew here or someone filming, she stands like this posing for the camera. I think she's enjoying it.
If she was stressed, she wouldn't be eating, she'd be standing in a corner. She's not doing any of that.
The reason she's called Fiona is because there was another sheep in New Zealand who also sheltered in a cave who was called Shrek. So we've got Shrek and Fiona. The other residents of Dalscone Farm seem rather intrigued by Fiona, while she has been playing it cool. Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC News, Dumfries.
More animals for you now. This one was thought to be extinct, but the hedgehog-like creature named after Sir David Attenborough has been captured on film for the first time. The species, named Attenborough's long-beaked echidna, is thought to have first emerged 200 million years ago and lived among the dinosaurs. Now it has been rediscovered in Indonesia, and Sir David himself is said to be absolutely delighted. Tomorrow marks the start of Remembrance Weekend, when we pause to remember the service and sacrifice of the nation's fallen service people. As part of the BBC's We Were There project, aimed at capturing the memories of veterans, Alan Little has been speaking to some of those who served in World War II. He spoke to Pamela Galloway, who served in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, Alfred Barney Barnett, who was a gunner in the Royal Air Force, and Stan Mincher, who served in the Royal Navy, and talked to them about their recollections of service.
I volunteered in the spring of 1942, just a few days really before my 20th birthday.
Everybody wanted to be pilots, but there was about a 2 or 3 year wait for that. And so I put my name down to be an air gunner.
We just thought it'd be like another exercise. What we didn't know, of course, what the opposition would be. Until the last moment.
Pamela Galloway joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. She was part of a secret operation to disrupt German bombing raids by using radio signals to lure the aircraft off course in what became known as the Battle of the Beams.
The wireless operators were able to identify, I suppose you call it the wavelength or the frequency, on which the German bombers were navigating. And so the wireless sending stations would send out a different frequency that would either confuse or make the German bombers follow a different course. And the result would be that they would miss their targets.
Alfred Barnett, known as Barney, was a gunner in the RAF. He flew more than 80 bombing missions over Germany.
Now, Lancaster used to carry 1 or 2 cookies, they're 4,000 pounders, in the centre bay. Then outside that, you'd have a few boxes, what they call incendiaries, just for lighting fires. Now, the idea was to mark the target, stir up some trouble, then drop the incendiaries to create fires. Like the biggest fire I ever saw was at Hamburg. When you're flying, I know this may sound strange, I used to start shaking here, and then when you got there, you were very calm. Amazing. But you go through hell going there, and hell coming back from it.
Stan Mincher joined the Royal Navy. He was 18 when he crossed the Channel on D-Day. His task was to deliver tanks to the beaches of Normandy.
The first thing we saw at about daylight was the minesweepers coming forward to sweep a channel to the beach. On the way in, we hit a landmine. It wasn't a big mine, and they blew a hole, but it didn't become a major problem. I could just see the sea wall and the houses beyond it. The initial forces in our area, Juno, were Canadian. They had a disastrous time, and majority of them were sunk on the beach with a lot of casualties. This was going to be the beginning of the end of the war. We had high hopes.
But I was thinking, gosh, if we'd got it wrong, that would have been very bad.
I'm no ruddy hero, but there it is, all over now. I've got £7 bob a day for that.
That report by Alan Little. Let's look at the weather now. Louise Lear is here. Hello.
Hi there, Sophie. Well, I suspect frost and fog's going to play its part this Remembrance weekend. We had some dense fog today, and actually, when that fog lingers, the temperatures really struggle. So temperatures in East Ayrshire probably only around 1 degree just before lunchtime, and then the fog cleared and the temperatures picked up. So yes, quite a cool, frosty, foggy weekend, mostly dry on Saturday. A bit of a question mark about where the rain will be sitting on Sunday. More details on that in just a moment, but let's all of us enjoy the window of fine weather that we are going to start the weekend with. Here it is on the satellite picture. This is what's waiting in the wings, pushing in during the early hours of Sunday morning. But for here and now, we've got some clearer skies. Direction of the wind driving in a few scattered showers through northern Scotland, down through Northern Ireland, maybe through the Cheshire Gap as well. But where we've got those clear skies, temperatures are likely to fall away into low single figures. So a chilly start, some frost around, some patchy fog. That could be dense in places, but it will lift. And for most of us, Saturday is looking a really promising day. Lots of sunny spells coming through. That northerly breeze driving in a few scattered showers into the northeast, and temperatures, well, a little where they should be really for this time of year, at around 8 to 12 degrees. Now, there could be some rain pushing into the southwest by the end of the day on Saturday, and this is those weather fronts that are moving in from the southwest. So there will be quite light and patchy to begin with. So for Remembrance Sunday, I suspect fog is going to be more of an issue. That will throw up some fairly dense patches of fog for a time during Sunday, and then we'll see showery outbreaks of rain. Now, maybe for the cenotaph it should stay dry. Showery rain across the southwest. Eventually that rain will push its way steadily northeast, dry in Scotland, cool for all of us. Sophie.
Louise, thank you. And that's it from the BBC News at 6. It is time now for the news where you are. Goodbye.
Tonight on BBC London.
This is broken us forever. For me personally, I don't even know how I'm going to even get on. I just don't know.
Remembering